Welcome back to MACNA 2021, Supporting an Equitable Trade. Our next speaker is someone I've known close to 2 decades since he was a younger man or a young man. His name is Dr. Andrew Rhyne, and he's here to talk to us about endangered trade, how the ESA, CITES, animal rights activists, and the climate change will shape the future of aquariums. Welcome to MACNA 2021, Andy.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me. It's almost 20 years now, right? And it's time flies so fast, and I still have such vivid memories of when I was in grad school at Florida Tech and the lab, and it doesn't seem like 20 years at all. I think that's the hallmark of getting old.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank you for inviting me to give a talk on the international trade of coral reef species. And I'm going to talk a little bit in generalities on trade data, and I don't want to get into too much of the actual data of things, and tell more of a story of what I see as to be the future interaction between climate change and the regulatory environment, combined with animal rights activists, and how that's going to really shape the future of aquariums. As part of that, I think it's always worth to remember that we import a lot of animals into the United States and the European Union, South America, and Asia. And there's a wide biodiversity of that. And the two iconic species really are the clownfish and the blue tang. And we've told quite a bit of stories around those. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about clownfish today. But at first, a couple of things I think that are very important to always acknowledge when I give talks, especially when I give a talk for the aquarium industry, is some of the funding I have is funding from Petco and also through PJAC, and that's money to work on cyanide detection. But I'm often asked about my industry funding. That's one of the first things that animal rights activists or reporters ask me, because they want to know if there's any potential conflicts. But I also have money to do, and have had money to do work on the trade and analyze trade data from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NOAA Fisheries, and also the NOAA Coral Reef Program, along with USAID's Wildlife Crime Technology Challenge. We won the grand prize in that challenge in 2016. And so over the last almost 10 years now, we've really looked very carefully at the trade in marine fish coming to the United States. And part of that examination really is around a treaty, an international treaty that many aquarists know because of how it impacts the trade in corals and clams and seahorses. So that's CITES, or the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. This is a treaty that basically says trade should be legal, sustainable, and traceable, and that it recognizes that legal trade of wild species can benefit conservation of the species and also livelihoods. And I think CITES was one of the first organizations that really understood the livelihoods piece of conservation. It's very hard to ask people in developing countries, or even in the United States, to conserve their wildlife and their wild lands if you do not ensure they have reasonable livelihoods and work. And so part of that trade-off between livelihoods is the international illegal trade in wildlife. And this illegal trade poses a severe risk to conservation of wild species. So CITES' really core mission is to regulate trade, to ensure that trade does not further endanger species under its purview. And it is an international treaty. So CITES is an international treaty organization, and each country enforces CITES regulations. In the United States, we have something called the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And the Endangered Species Act is one of the hallmarks of environmental regulations in the United States. It's really an amazing law. And to me, it's more amazing at how the law got passed. President Nixon, arguably one of the most conservative presidents in the in the United States history, signed the Endangered Species Act into law. And I think most people know the Endangered Species Act because of the charismatic wildlife that it has protected, whether that's grizzly bears or the bald eagle. And there was so much environmental damage done in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that people didn't realize, and there was really this great awakening in the United States in the 1960s and 70s to that damage. And that's really where the Endangered Species Act came from. And you can see recovery in species that are protected from the Endangered Species Act. And if you fast forward into the early 2000s, mid 2000s, we start to interact with climate change quite a bit more. And scientists have been worried and concerned about the increasing amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels for over 100 years. And that has reached a pinnacle in the late 90s with concern in international meetings. There's been a lot of denialism about this, mainly from the oil and gas lobby and also other industries that would be harmed by reduction of consumption of fossil fuels. But it's an undeniable fact that we have increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere a great deal over the last 100 years. And for coral reef hobbyists, this is actually quite noticeable. And people who keep corals in their tanks actually notice these phenomenons in their tanks when it comes to pH and alkalinity. And this shift is actually going to happen in the oceans as well. And so I'm not sure how many aquarists are familiar with saturation state, but this is a kind of a measure of how easy it is for aragonite or calcium carbonate to precipitate out. And you can think of it as how easy is it for corals to make, or calcifiers to make their skeleton. And as we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can see that we've lost these really saturated states. So very, very easy for calcification to occur. And it's going to become much, much, much more difficult for calcification to occur, to the point where at some point saturation states are going to get fairly low. And that's what these red colors are indicating. It's going to be much, much more difficult for corals to maintain positive calcium carbonate deposition in the face of other stressors. And on top of that, the loss of saturation state, climate change also is, as people are well aware of now, is increasing ocean temperatures. And we're seeing massive amounts of coral bleaching year after year after year that is unknown to human history. And so 1998 was the kind of the watershed moment for this. We had a worldwide coral bleaching event. And then it has progressively, those used to be fairly far spaced apart. And those bleaching events are getting closer together. And the Great Barrier Reef in Australia really now has been greatly impacted by this. And I think this photo is really illustrative of the dangers that coral bleaching has on people's aquariums. And that is, not only are the corals bleaching, but the fish that utilize that habitat and make their homes around coral reefs are highly impacted by the loss of those live corals. And so you may have 100% captive bred corals that are grown in your basement or your friends, and you frag swapped, and maybe you think you're immune to what happens on coral reefs, but a lot of the fish that are coming from those coral reefs are negatively impacted by this degradation of the environment. And so whether it's destructive fishing or some type of or overdevelopment for tourism and hotels and large cities being built on coastlines, all the habitat degradation that's happened over the last 40 years in these really biodiverse rich regions of the world, those have negatively impacted coral reefs, and it impacts the fish that we find there. And now we're at a state where bleaching and other events are happening at such a rate, even reefs that are remote from humans are being impacted. So if you take existing environmental laws and treaty organizations that are designed to protect species from becoming endangered, and you add climate change to that, what you're going to see is a convergence of many more species becoming at risk of extinction, or at least been threatened or endangered of extinction. And then those laws are going to intersect with that. And the third component of this, or the fourth component of this, with CITES, international treaties, the US law, Endangered Species Act, and climate change really are wildlife activists. And so animal rights activists have really focused on the aquarium trade in several key ways. And I think the most high profile person that has really intersected with that on the aquarium trade really is Renee Umberger with For the Fishes. And she has really made it her life's mission to eliminate the aquarium trade in Hawaii. And you can look at what's happened in Hawaii over the last 10 years or so and measure her successes has been fairly successful in impacting the commercial trade of fishes from Hawaii. We can debate the data, and the data really doesn't support a lot of her arguments, but she has been successful in their legal fights and reducing the ability of fishermen to collect fish in Hawaii. And so a lot of the arguments that are made are that habitats are degraded, ecosystems are under threat, coral reefs are under threat from so many things that we must do something. And you're seeing countries ban sunscreens, for example, with very, very little to no evidence that sunscreens actually damage corals. And so there's going to be a lot of interest from governments to do something. And there's groups that do not particularly want to see fish that are collected from wild habitats traded for the aquarium trade. And all of that is going to come together and has impacted the aquarium hobby. So I think it's important to remember where a lot of your fish come from, and those are very distant and dispersed supply chains. And so most of our fish come from Indonesia and the Philippines. About 88%, 89% of those come from the Indonesian Philippines. Some of our fish come from the Middle East and Kenya, and some from very remote islands in the Indian Ocean or in the South Pacific. These are very dispersed supply chains. They're very long supply chains, and these long supply chains really limit our traceability. And I've used this infographic from Cairns Marine for a number of years to illustrate really kind of a good concept of how fish are collected. So there's lots of collectors that are working in very remote areas in these countries or in remote islands, and they often consolidate those at the village level, and then they get consolidated further at collection stations and moved along the transport chain to the point where it's very, very difficult for a hobbyist or an end consumer or a fish store, and even sometimes importers, to know where those fish came from. And so one analogy that I use a lot is that our fish that we keep in aquariums and the clothes we wear have a lot in common, and that is that we really have no idea who produced those items. So we don't really know who caught our fish and how our fish were caught, and we really don't know how our clothes were made and who made those clothes. And so and the problems in those supply chains are not that dispersed, and those issues of equity and livelihoods are equal in both industries. Somebody can make a living and educate their kids making clothes. It can be an honorable living, and it can be a good living if they're paid a living wage and they have access to medical care and education. But they also can be taken advantage of and work in sweatshops, and you have child labor problems. And in the aquarium trade, we don't know often where our fish come from, and they could be coming from areas where people are fishing sustainably and ethically and selling those fish and making a viable income and support it with sustainable fisheries, or they could be coming from areas where fishermen are using cyanide and other destructive methods and degrading the habitat and not making it a living. So those are very similar problems, and I think it's helpful for people to understand that the problems with the supply chain in aquarium fish are not really that much different than the problems in supply chain of seafood or clothing or other things. But one thing is certain: that if we don't address these supply chain issues and the long-term sustainability of the trade, then that directly threatens the survival of the aquarium trade, because we are reliant on these wild ecosystems. And I love this photo of these glowfish because I have young children, and really nothing is really as instructive or as good of a gateway into science as in an aquarium. Kids love brightly colored things, and these genetically modified fish are really not for me, because I've never really found them interesting, but they really have been developed for young kids because they're brightly colored and really interesting to look at. And this is also very removed from wild fish that we have in the marine aquarium industry. These are almost as opposite of as a wild fish as you could get. They're captive bred, genetically modified fish to glow different colors. And so you could argue that maybe these fish are completely remote from wild ecosystems. But if we go back to the Endangered Species Act, that's actually not true, because if any of these species in here were listed as an endangered species, the trade of that species could be eliminated in the United States. And so we are tied to those ecosystems. And it's that tie back to those ecosystems and how fish are collected and traded that is often forgotten about. And cyanide fishing is part of that history, and it is still part of the trade and what happens in the trade today. And it's a very murky story, and it's very hard to get accurate information about. But we know it's a threat, and it has been a threat for a long time, and it threatens ecosystems, the corals themselves, and also the fish that are collected. And I have never met anyone who actually wants to buy a cyanide caught fish, but they're in the marketplace at some level that we actually have trouble knowing how much that is. And I'll talk a little bit about that, the impacts of that in a minute. But part of the difficulties of knowing where fish came from and if they're caught with cyanide or not caught with cyanide from Indonesia or the Philippines or Vietnam or some of these other hotspots around the world is the supply chain. And so this is an actual map of the supply chain on the north coast of Bali that existed around 2009 or so when this report was published. And this is really an amazing piece of work to develop the supply chain. And this report is available online. It's an open access document. I've put it on one of the cloud servers that allows to host data in an open format for the authors of this, because it had disappeared for a few years. So anyone can get access to it. If you're interested in getting access to it, we can provide a link to that. But this supply chain is really murky, and it's really hard to see and understand what's going on. And if we zoom in a little bit to this great little village in the north coast of Bali called Les Village, and the fishermen there it's been a really well-documented case of fishermen that were using cyanide, had observed cyanide fishermen coming over from Banyuwangi and the Java coast over into Bali, watched them collect with cyanide, obtain cyanide, started fishing with cyanide, and then watched their habitats be degraded over a series of years. And then an NGO working with as part of a larger group effort in the late 90s, early 2000s, really started working with fishermen, and these fishermen stopped using cyanide and set up MPAs and really have helped restore some of their habitat. And it's a fascinating story. It's a great place to visit. And this is exactly where you want to get your fish from, because you're supporting a group of fishermen that are working in a co-op. They collect to order. They don't overfish their area. They have marine protected areas. They use nets. And they're committed to the health of their ecosystem. The challenge is that you can't actually buy their fish because, or at least intentionally, because these fish get washed into this supply chain, and they're not labeled. There's no certification method. There's no mechanism to get their fish into the United States or Europe in a way where you actually would know that you can buy them. I know wholesalers that buy fish from Les Village, exporters, and I know importers that probably buy fish from less village, but you can't differentiate a less village fish from another fish in this area. And so it makes it really hard for you to know what you're buying and if you're supporting a sustainable fishery. And there's been a lot of discussion about cyanide over the years, and it pops up occasionally. And an interesting way it popped up in 2016 was this National Geographic article that really caught a lot of people's attention. And the headline is true that catching fish with cyanide is really a horrific way to catch fish, right? But the subheading there is completely false, and that 90% of the fish are not caught with cyanide. That's just not true. And the challenge is there's not a lot of data to allow us to go back and actually provide accurate numbers for this. So animal rights activists are able to take a loosely worded sentence in a federal report on cyanide fishing in 2008 and kind of twist that and give that to a National Geographic editor in a way that makes it seem plausible and makes it pass fact checking. And it's not until the story comes out and people are in the aquarium industry are really outraged and upset by that figure and start asking a lot of questions. They asked us to get to look at it, and we started combing the data and talking to the writers of the story and trying to figure out where that number came from. That you really understood how intertangled it was, but it came from a PR push by the Center for Biodiversity and for the Fishes to really try to push this narrative that most of the fish coming to the United States for the marine aquarium trade are caught with cyanide, because coral reefs are endangered ecosystems. Cyanide fishing is very destructive fishing. It's illegal where it happens, and these two things really cannot coexist together. So they took this information, they took that PR, and they petitioned the United States government to require testing for fish or cease imports of tropical fish until they could provide some type of cyanide-free certification scheme. On the surface, this actually, to me, having a cyanide-free certification scheme is actually not a bad idea, and it's probably something that needs to happen. The challenge is that how do you go about doing that, and what's the real motivations of these groups in curtailing cyanide fishing, or is it really to eliminate the keeping of fish in aquariums? And I think it's probably a little bit of both, and it depends on which organization that we're speaking about. But the Center for Biodiversity really has a hallmark reputation of petitioning the United States government for listing of species on the Endangered Species Act and trying to use legal remedies to conserve populations. And I think you could legitimately say a lot of their work has been very successful in protecting populations of terrestrial mammals in the United States or other things, and trying to restore populations of species through the Endangered Species Act. And this intersection of habitat degradation, destructive fishing, and activism really has come together in a way that is quite disruptive and challenging for the aquarium industry to handle. So you could suggest that, well, we should require a cyanide detection test for fish coming into the country, and we should demonstrate that they are not. And that's actually what this petition does. This petition actually said that Fish and Wildlife or NOAA should either test or require some certification. And they use a paper that was published in 2012 that suggested that there was a reliable test to determine if fish had been collected with cyanide. But the problem is that that test is not based on actual biological data. And we have demonstrated this through a series of publications. So there was a real rush to put this petition out and petition the government to require a certification scheme for cyanide fishing by these activist groups without really understanding the data. And there's actually some really good evidence. If you'll recall the slide that I showed of Ms. Umberger with the presentation that her and Craig Downs gave at the International Coral Reef Symposium, where they got up in front of a group of scientists and had suggested that they had replicated the cyanide detection test and found cyanide presence in many marine fish that were being imported. But that's objectively false, and there's no evidence that that data was real in any way. In fact, our data that we've published demonstrates very conclusively that this data that they presented is not possible. And so this, you have an interesting mix between very powerful U.S. laws, the Lacey Act, the Endangered Species Act, and activism that has really caused a lot of consternation in the aquarium industry. But it's undeniable that cyanide fishing is a large problem. So I gave an interview in 2018 for a Smithsonian Magazine article, and when I saw the title of it, I think it actually highlights this problem that the aquarium trade is going to have in the future quite well. And that is you can walk into a store and buy a nearly extinct animal that has been bred in captivity, whether it's a freshwater fish or a marine fish or some other organism. And this article actually does a really good job of kind of looking at the commercialization of these species and is that is there a positive impact there or a negative impact? And hobbyists really got a really close look at these impacts in 2009 or so, when the Center for Biodiversity petitioned the United States government to list 83 species of corals. And if you've had corals in any length of time, if you were in the industry back then, this caused a lot of problems because listing under the Endangered Species Act has some significant ramifications for commercial trade. So if these were freshwater organisms, they would be under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. U.S. Fish and Wildlife prohibits commercial trade of any species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act. Because these are marine species, the purview for these listings came to NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and National Marine Fisheries Service. And so they were charged with evaluating this petition. They're legally required to evaluate the merits of the petition. And so there was a multi-year process that went through, and they had to review every single species that was petitioned. This was the first petition I remember that was done with this many species involved. And this really posed a significant challenge for the federal government. This was one of the first listings proposals where there was almost no biological data on the species that were being listed. And most of these were being listed, if not all of them, really because of the effects of climate change. However, the Center for Biodiversity did point to the aquarium trade and the trade of these species as a significant impact of their populations and a threat. And so while the petition really was about climate change and the impacts of climate change on the future of coral reefs, and an effort to try to curb greenhouse gases through the Endangered Species Act, or at least require the government to take some regulatory action. The aquarium trade is kind of caught in the middle with this, whether they have any impact on the species or not. And there's a series of articles that have come through that demonstrated these impacts and how this ESA listing petition and the fact that some of these corals were listed as threatened or endangered on the Endangered Species Act have impacted the trade. Now, it's a little bit nuanced, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife views the Endangered Species Act a little differently than the National Marine Fisheries Service. But if species are listed as threatened, the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA, does not have to prohibit trade if they're listed as threatened. They have to actually go through a separate rulemaking process to prohibit or limit trade. And that's an automatic process of Fish and Wildlife if it was a terrestrial or freshwater organism. But Fish and Wildlife oversees the importation and regulations of imports and exports of all wildlife and wildlife products. So there was some, a lot of back and forth with Fish and Wildlife, and some coral imports were looked like they were told that, the industry was told they could not import certain corals, and a lot of problems happened in the 2012, 2014, 15 period when these listings were occurring, and it caused a lot of frustration with both hobbyists who didn't understand what was happening and why could the government tell them that they can't keep their corals, or they might not be able to, their corals might not be able to be traded across state lines, even if they're grown in their basement. And also with importers who are trying to import corals that are CITES listed, which are quite a regulatory burden and a lot of paperwork and expense, but also now listed under the Endangered Species Act. If you go forward a little bit in time, these issues have not really resolved themselves. Fiji instituted a ban in live corals. This was really at the request of, I believe, the British government or some NGOs that were trying to look at the health of the ocean. And this was Fiji's way of saying that they were doing something for coral reefs. They're going to ban the export of live corals and live rock. And the Fiji live coral trade was actually one of the hallmarks of a sustainable small-scale fishery. And it was shut down in a very short period of time, and that cost hundreds of jobs. And it was that job loss was actually covered in some international news. And so there's real ramifications for these small communities that are impacted by these trades. They've made a living off of these corals for quite some time, and now they find themselves out of a job. Indonesia is another good example of how CITES and international trade has intersected. So because CITES permits are required to export corals, even if they're aquaculture, that greatly impacts people's ability to import and export corals without permits. And so there's been a lot of back and forth in the government of Indonesia about shipping corals, and there was a coral trade ban for quite some time in Indonesia that really affected the supply of corals into the aquarium trade. And we've published quite a bit about corals and sustainability and livelihoods. And I think hobbyists often forget, because so many corals are grown in captivity, and that they can go to the store and buy a lot of corals that were grown in the United States, that there is a fairly robust wild trade or aquaculture trade. There's a fairly robust trade of corals from a lot of countries in the South Pacific. So Fiji, Solomon Islands, Indonesia, and some other and Australia trade quite a bit of corals. And so there's been we've looked at this quite carefully from the available data, and a lot of those trades have remarkably changed over the last 10 years or so, or they have been at a very small scale. And so really the sustainability of the corals, even though corals are a threatened organism from climate change, the threats from the coral fishery itself is quite low, but there's still that interaction. And just to give you an idea of how much the coral trade has changed in Indonesia, if you look at US imports of Indonesian aquaport species, you'll see that there's this massive shift from almost 100% wild fishery over to almost 100% aquaculture fishery now from Indonesia. And it's been quite remarkable. And this is because Indonesia has really grown aquaculture of corals at a scale that really no other country has. It's really at an industrial scale. There's this really interesting review article that was published about aquaculture methods for corals, and they actually use some of the photos that have been used in press accounts of the Indonesian coral trade. You can see these racks, and there are thousands and thousands of corals on these racks in Indonesia being grown for hobbyists. And the challenge with that is that we have good tracking if those corals leave Indonesia and come into the United States or another CITES country, because there's permits required and data required. But if corals are grown in the country that they're sold in, we have almost no data with that. And so we actually don't have really any good data to support a real fundamental understanding of how many corals are traded in the United States, because a lot of the corals that are traded in the United States are grown in the United States. And so it's not really possible for someone to tell you what the size of the coral trade is in the United States because of the domestic production we have, and the lack of data that comes from that domestic production. And then we know what's been imported. The other thing to remember about aquaculture is that aquaculture is quickly evolving. And I think Jamie Craig's work is emblematic of that. We now can control spawn and get sexual spawning of corals. So to date, before his work, corals were all fragmented basically in and propagated much as you would vegetatively. You would break them off and grow them, and this is very successful in Indonesia. I've dove on coral farms that had thousands and thousands and thousands of red euphyllias and really rare acroporas and montiporas that people just don't get to see that many of in the United States, and they're farming them at industrial scale. But the advent of sexual reproduction in corals is really going to increase the variety and the number of corals that you'll probably see in the coming years, because it will allow for aquaculture to really take advantage of massive brood production and low natural survival in the wild. When we can remove mortality with aquaculture, we can really increase the amount of species that are, or the amount of something that's produced. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years or so with aquaculture and corals. But again, we will have almost no data on this, because it's most likely that a lot of these corals will be produced in the country at which they're sold, which will unfortunately eliminate the income stream that has been going to these countries where the corals are from. And I find that very unfortunate. And there's a lot of debate in the hobby about what the value is of corals that are grown in people's tanks versus corals that are imported from mariculture farms or wild corals. But things are going to rapidly change. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about clownfish, and then I'll talk about the bang-eyed cardinal and then giant clams. Center for Biodiversity also petitioned to list the percula clownfish under the Endangered Species Act, with some other fish as well. Again, citing climate change, but also the trade in aquarium fish. And so when this listing petition came forward, we were asked to produce if we could provide some data. So we have really the only source of trade data that has been produced in the last 20 years or so. And so we've looked at the data of clownfish coming into the United States. And the petition noted that there were several 100,000 ocellaris and percula being traded every year. And in our data set originally, when we published our first paper and also on the Aquarium Trade Data website, we often lumped ocellaris and percula together because that's how they were on the invoices. So it was impossible to tell which species was which. So we put those together. And the Center for Biodiversity took that number and they basically said, this is how many percula are sold every year. And this trade in Amphiprion percula is threatening the species in conjunction with climate change. And so what we did for the US government is we really went back to those invoices and mined all of that data again and looked at every single clownfish species and how many were coming in. And then we parsed those out by what country they were from, and if the export country that these fish were exported from matched its geographic distribution. And what we can say for certain is there's a lot of species who do not have matches with their geographic distribution. So the black portion of the bars are those species that are traded outside of their natural range. So these are almost certainly misidentifications. These are honest misidentifications because as anyone who works in fish taxonomy can tell you that the names have moved around quite a bit, but importers and exporters tend to use a lot of old trade names and old scientific names on their invoices. So a lot of these species are outside their natural range. And percula is one of those species. And so if we come in and zoom in and take a closer look at this, you'll see that in our database, there are hundreds of thousands of clownfish coming out of Indonesia and the Philippines in the years that we have data for. So 2005, 2008, 2009, 2011. And at this same time, there was a lot of aquaculture production happening. And so I would challenge anyone to find a wild Ocellaris clownfish in the United States right now. It's probably actually quite hard. When I've gotten broodstock in, I actually have to ask for them because the importers that we buy fish from do not buy wild clownfish anymore. But there's still a lot of wild clownfish in our database coming in for those years. And these show up as Ocellaris and Percula. And so if you look at Percula, for example, in this complex, if you look, you'll see that these in red here are outside of Percula's geographic range. And the blue are confirmed aquaculture shipments of clownfish. And then the green are the natural range of Percula. Now, Papua and Papua New Guinea and West Papua, where Indonesia is part of the island, there is collection that happens in West Papua, and there is Percula that are collected there and moved into either Jakarta or Bali and then exported out. So it's impossible to know what proportion of these Percula that show up on invoices are mislabeled versus what's actually Percula. But what we do know is that based on geographic location, and we were able to validate this with our data, is that most of the Percula that's traded, there are some geographic matches. So about 58% match from Indonesia. If we consider Indonesia a source because of West Papua, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, and we say, okay, we're going to assume that Indonesia is correctly labeling their fish as Percula or Ocellaris, then 58% or so are in their geographic range, but 41% are geographic mismatches. And most all of those are misidentifications. We know 93% or so are misidentifications. The Philippines, several exporters in the Philippines mark all their clownfishes as Percula, but they're really Ocellaris. They have a little slightly different color pattern of Ocellaris, but they're really Ocellaris. And then you have some cultured Percula that's coming out of other countries. And then versus Ocellaris, which has a 96% geographic match that's coming from its range. It has a much wider geographic distribution. And then there are some geographic mismatches, and we believe all of those are cultured. But the take-home message of this is that the aquarium trade in no way is endangering wild Percula clownfish with extinction. And so we provided this data to the United States government, and they came back with their findings that based on the population of clownfish, of Percula, they estimated to be in the tens of millions, and this tiny fraction of trade that's happening, we're talking, less than 100,000 over the time period. And they believe that to be a gross overestimation of the actual trade in wild fish, that there really is no impact in that wild trade on wild populations. Now, a good counter to this example is the bang-eyed cardinalfish. And the bang-eyed cardinalfish was also proposed to be listed under the Endangered Species Act relatively recently. And it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so NOAA received a petition from a petitioner and reviewed that petition, looked at the data, and the data in this case is really unequivocal that the wild populations in the wild geographic range of bang-eyed cardinals have been significantly impacted by the aquarium trade. Now, there is a lot of populations that have been established at collection stations. Bang-eyed cardinals now are invasive in certain areas and actually a problem. But in their geographic range, in their natural geographic range, they are threatened. And so we again provided data for this. The bang-eyed cardinalfish is a really unfortunate story because it should have been listed under CITES over a decade ago, which would really have helped protect its populations, but it wasn't. And the wild fishery in that shows up in our database. We think in 125,000 per year were coming into the country in our data set. It's important to note this was declining over time, And this decline was a little larger than the decline we saw because of the economic situation in the US, where we saw an overall decline in trade. We're pretty certain that that decline that we saw in wild imports was because of a large increase in imports of aquaculture fish. And so we were able to provide the US government with really definitive information that showed that there's a large number of aquaculture bang-eyed cardinals coming in from Thailand. And that production had started in the 2013 range or so. Unfortunately, even though this fish was listed in 2016 as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took no action to actually collect any data on its imports. They could have mandated that this fish was actually listed on the front of the importation forms and not just in the invoices, but there is no evidence that they've taken any action at all to actually collect any data on these fish. So we have essentially a data limited system where we don't know a lot about the species. And so what we have been doing is looking at how to deal with data limited fisheries. And there's a really widely used fisheries model for data limited fisheries that was produced out of Australia for a fishery in Australia that was data limited. It's been used for the aquarium trade a couple of times. And one of my former students, part of her senior thesis, which we published in the Marine Ecology Progress Series, Gabby, who's a former MACNA scholarship winner, her work was really looking at trying to make this model more robust and make the model a little bit more mathematically sound. And what we looked at were the top 30 species or so in the trade, and there's a couple species that really stick out. One is the bang-eyed cardinal fish, and the red here is what we would consider to be an unsustainable trade, and the other is the blue tang. These have vastly different reproductive strategies, but there is really no question that the bang-eyed cardinal was endangered in large part by the aquarium trade. Now, it also suffers from habitat destruction because the urchins that these fish need to live in are being fished really heavily in this area in Indonesia, and so they're losing habitat as well. While we found most fish were sustainable or highly sustainable in the aquarium trade, we did find that the bang-eyed cardinal was an unsustainable wild fishery. And so recently, the Center for Biodiversity, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Animal Welfare Institute petitioned the United States government to undertake 4D rulemaking for the bang-eyed cardinal. And so 4D rulemaking is that process where National Marine Fisheries Service will undergo a review and determine if the petitioners are correct and that the importation and sale of bang-eyed cardinals should be banned. This has large ramifications for aquariums. Most of the bang-eyed cardinal fish that you probably buy now are aquaculture, and that's probably going to increase greatly. So it's a great fish for your tank. It's readily available as an aquaculture fish. We don't have a lot of insight in what's coming into the country anymore, wild or aquaculture, because the government hasn't bothered to collect the information. And now you have a valid petition to the government to undertake 4D rulemaking. And so what NOAA will have to do now, the National Marine Fisheries Service will have to do, is to take the available data they have and look at that data and look at the situation of the bang-eyed cardinal fish and either accept this or agree with this petition or reject the petition. And the Center for Biodiversity makes their living, so to say, off of suing the US government and winning a lot of lawsuits and legal fees in court. And so you could see this battle to be probably pretty protracted over time. It's hard to know exactly what the National Marine Fisheries Service will do. I personally think that the flexibility that NOAA has with rulemaking versus the Fish and Wildlife Service is actually quite valuable because it allows them to protect species habitat and work on restoration plans under the Endangered Species Act, but it would allow for the trade of that or the take of that species if the trade is not harming the natural population. It's really unfortunate that we have no data past 2013 for this species, because right now is actually when data is most needed. There are no trade statistics that I'm aware of that would give the government any insight onto what is the volume of wild fish versus aquaculture fish coming into the country. And so in the absence of that data, I don't know how the US government will actually make a science-based decision on this. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. But this is, again, a case of a species that I think undeniably the aquarium trade has impacted its population, and now it could suffer the ramifications of that. So the last group of taxa I'm going to talk about when it comes to the intersection of climate change and Endangered Species Act are giant clams, the tridacnids. And so the giant clams have been also petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. And I'm sure if you keep corals and keep clams and keep fish in your aquariums, and after listening to this, you might feel like your ability to keep these organisms in your house is under attack. And I can understand how people would feel this way when you keep seeing petitions rolling off of, and coming to the US government. But there is an undeniable situation that giant clams populations have been severely impacted in the wild. And you can see that basically none of this impact really is from the aquarium trade. It's their entire populations of clams that have been stripped off of these islands that are in dispute by China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and Vietnam, and they have been taken back to China, and they are sold for meat and shells, and there's quite an industry around this. And so these are very old organisms, and their populations have been really impacted in these areas. And so this petition is, again, a valid petition that was submitted by a citizen of the United States or an organization in the United States. And so therefore the US government has to look at it, and they will review the available data. Because giant clams are listed under CITES, we actually have good trade data. And if you look at the data for imports of live clams in the United States, so because they're live, I'm assuming they're for the aquarium trade and they're not for food. And if we look at a window from 2000 to 2017, about 1 million clams or so were imported in the United States, and that's about 61,000 clams a year. A large portion of those came from Vietnam in that period. And then there's a lot of smaller imports coming from the South Pacific Islands, or a few coming out of the Red Sea, and a little bit out of Australia. There's some aquaculture production in Australia, and so the Marshall Islands is another source, and so there's a lot of aquaculture production in here, and then a lot of clams that are wild. If you take and look at the last 2 years in the data set that I had, and just look at 2015 to 2017, you can see a real change in the trade. And the number has reduced greatly, but also you can see that the basic absence of Vietnam in the US imports of clams. And this is really because of a disease concern, and they're listed as a pathogen threat to clams in the US. And so getting clams in from Vietnam is quite challenging, and so the US essentially does not import them anymore. So we do bring clams in, again, that are mostly aquaculture. There are some wild clams still coming in, but most of these are aquaculture that are coming into the United States. And it's quite a remarkable shift from smatterings from other countries to really just a few countries that are producing some wild clams, some aquaculture clams, and really that the loss of Vietnam. But that doesn't mean that Vietnam is not trading clams. It just means they're not coming to the United States. And so you can see that they're shipping clams here to Europe and also to Brazil. And I was really surprised by this when I saw Brazil come up. I produced this data for a talk I gave at an aquaculture meeting on giant clams, and the person that hosted the meeting is actually from Brazil, and he gave us quite a bit of insight on how this has grown and how the importation of clams into Brazil has increased. And but you can see that that the numbers are very low, 1,500 or so per year from Vietnam. And that really is a story of what disease can do and regulations for pathogens can do to the import or export of taxa in from a country to another. So we'll go back to this. You can walk into a store and buy a nearly extinct species, and we can think about questions like, should we be able to do this? Is this something you should be able to do? Should we be able to go into a store and buy something that's either extinct in the wild, which you can do in the freshwater aquarium trade, or something that is threatened with extinction, likely to become extinct, or going to be much worse off in the coming years because of climate change? And I think the way we answer that question is we have to ask what the role of the marine aquarium trade is in coral reef conservation. And if we have a positive role in conservation of ecosystems, then I think that allows for us to have a conversation about trading in these species. And so that conversation is going to happen a lot in the next couple of years. It's going to grow. It's going to continue to grow. CITES is undertaking a review of the marine aquarium fish trade right now. It's a very interesting process. CITES is a very political organization. It's been an interesting process to watch from the sidelines because they're going to do this review essentially in the complete absence of any recent trade data, and so it'll be interesting to see what the reports come out and say, and how they're able to actually make some type of determination about marine aquarium fish and where they come from in those species that should be of concern. Most fish are in the aquarium trade, almost all of them. There are only a few that are CITES listed, the seahorses and then the hump-headed wrasse. But CITES is going to take a look at all marine aquarium fish and produce some type of report. The UNEP will produce that report. United Nations Environmental Program will produce that report, I believe, and then they'll have a series of workshops. But there really is no data to support this type of review, and it's really unfortunate. And the lack of we've put the data that we collected online at aquariumtradedata.org, but this data set is like me, is getting quite old. The last set of trade data we have is 2011, and that's 10 years now. And while time goes really fast, that doesn't inform us a lot about what's happening now. We have proposed a method for governments to be able to collect data automatically and put data into databases, but we have been unsuccessful in getting governments to actually do that. So there's not a single data system that's currently available that governments use that actually can capture shipment level data for trades like the freshwater trade or the marine aquarium trade. They are completely devoid. The data systems that governments use are either based on harmonized codes or other truncated data sets, and they essentially are useless in the determination of what is being traded and the value of that trade and the threats that trade poses to the conservation status of species. And that's really unfortunate, because we do know that there are good examples of the trade providing valuable income and having very little impact on ecosystems. The best examples that I can give you, other than the Kona coast of Hawaii of having a really sustainable, scientifically documented trade, are the South Pacific Islands. So the South Pacific Islands are a very diverse area. They're very hard to get to. They have very limited plane flights and limited cargo space. And so that limits their ability to export fish, and in some way puts controls on those fisheries. And then you add in countries like Australia, which have extraordinarily high levels of fishery management. And so this area is really a bright spot for aquarium fish. You can be confident that your fish that come from these areas are not collected with cyanide, and you can be confident that most of the fish that come from these areas are not over collected. That's not always the case. There's some concerns in the Marshall Islands of overcollection in certain islands for some pygmy angelfish, but there is good fishery management and really great stories. Christmas Island or Kiribati, I'll show you an example of them in just a minute, or New Caledonia with the conspiculatus angel, Fiji with its really robust net collection and tight supply chain, French Polynesia supplying some really valuable fish in very limited numbers. This area provides income. Just to, there's about $1 million in income that was coming into Kiribati. And that's a very small island, and that's a significant amount of income that comes into those areas and provides jobs for fishermen. They essentially operate with a small tourism economy and a large fishing economy, mostly tuna. But these nearshore coral reef fisheries supply valuable income. And so some examples of this high value, low volume trade is the conspiculatus angel. This is a very expensive fish because it had been very rare. And this wild fishery really produces decent income for these fishermen who collect this. And there's very few of these that are collected from New Caledonia. So this is a very limited trade. Less than 100 fish in our database across the years that we have data. So 2005, 8, and 9 and 11. So the hawk, the flame hawk. The flame hawk primarily comes out of French Polynesia, out of Tahiti, and it's been collected. It's collected in a sustainable method, and there's no evidence that its populations are under threat from the trade. It's a very high value fish, and so these are the types of fisheries that provide income to fishermen. And I think livelihoods is a really important component to the aquarium trade, and I think something that hobbyists sometimes don't understand enough is how much they can provide livelihoods to remote areas through the purchase of sustainably caught fish. Again, the Marshall Islands and Kiribati and Vanuatu show up for flame angels or the other centropyges that are quite valuable. Indonesia does have some multicoloreds, but you can get multicolored angels from the Marshall Islands as well. And so your flame angels, for example, bring a lot of income into Kiribati. They have a pretty robust management plan they put in place after they had noticed that they were shipping a lot of fish out of this island and the price had come down, and they were essentially catching twice as much fish for half as much money. And so they put some export controls and the price went back up. And I think this fishery is one of those that's very highlighted. There's some problems in the Marshall Islands with their fishery, but in no way are the problems in the Marshall Islands similar to the problems in Indonesia or the Philippines. So to wrap up, climate change threatens ecosystems such as coral reefs. It's undeniable that the Earth is warming and has been warming for quite some time and is warming rapidly. The heat waves in the west coast of the United States, the droughts, the intensification of a hurricane in about 24 hours from a category 1 to a category 4. These things are not something that we were accustomed to, and things that we're going to have to become accustomed to. And part of that is you're going to see entire ecosystems be degraded and become endangered. And as those ecosystems become degraded, people are going to demand action to try to do something about those. It's unfortunate that action will probably not to deal with the actual cause of this degradation, which is going to be firmly rooted in greenhouse gas emissions. But there is also the impacts of overdevelopment, overexploitation of resources that comes in. And as regulations are being made, many of these are blind to the source of aquarium species. So people might feel comfortable growing corals in their house and think that they can always trade these and they will always be able to sell corals, but this might not be the case. It might be one day that corals are deemed illegal to trade or to keep in your house because of the degradation that's happened on wild ecosystems based on the current laws in the US. And this could happen in other countries as well. I think that this is something that hobbyists need to engage with. They need to understand these laws. They need to understand the impact of the degradation of ecosystems on their hobby and take some ownership of that and understand what their role can be into either shaping regulations to be less impactful on sustainable trade, or and also the trade to be less impactful on these ecosystems. And with that, I would like to thank MACNA for their support in asking me to talk at MACNA, and again thank PJAC and Petco for the funding on the SciNab work we're doing, which we'll have some more data to talk about very shortly, and acknowledge that I've gotten funding from National Marine Fisheries Service and USAID and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And also a huge thanks to Dominion Diagnostics for providing a lot of support for the Ultra HPLC work we do on cyanide detection. So thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Andy. Real quickly, the next thing after this is the question and answer session. So you can go to macna.org/questions, click on Andy's name. And I know he just covered a lot, so get your questions in quickly. We'll start with the other speakers of the day, and then we'll get to Andy's. Andy, you just covered so much. And I just want to ask, for the hobbyists who are watching, maybe the store owners, and hopefully some importers who are watching too, is there any steps, any actions they can take to either promote transparency or make sure they're buying domestically aquacultured? How can they take any sort of action?
Yeah, I think if you look at importers, if we take importers for example, you have a array of importers. You have those that are very ethically minded, very sustainably minded. Then you have those that are just trading in fish and corals and don't necessarily care where things are coming from. And these two entities occupy the same space at the same time, and it really puts a lot of pressure on the ethically minded importers to because they're competing against people who are selling things for a lot less money, and that imbalance causes a lot of problems, and I think it creates a lot of problems. And so I think when business owners and a lot of hobbyists hear regulations, they really get upset about that. They are really anti-regulations, and I think they should look at it as protections. I don't think people look at regulations as protections enough. For example, CITES. CITES can be seen as a huge regulatory burden for an import. You can't just import corals. I can't just call up and be like, I'd like to import some corals. I got to get a bunch of permits, blah, 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 do a whole bunch of things. So I have to go through a company that does that. So if you are ethically importing corals and you understand CITES, somebody just can't jump in your space very easily. It costs a lot of money to get into your space. And I think if we looked at it that way and we said we need to protect the ethical importers, and there needs to be some barriers in place so somebody with a garage just can't start importing fish from who knows where and selling them for whatever reason. You have to have some skin in the game and understand your trade and have some type of ability to keep animals alive. If we just did that, I think that it would really elevate the standards of care and eliminate a lot of the concerns that animal rights activists have with the aquarium trade. I think that's where we can start. Hobbyists I used to refer hobbyists to, stores that bought from a few wholesalers. And I don't mind doing that. I don't mind saying that, I do know that, we sell fish out of my lab, the excess production out of my lab to an importer in the US. I only sell to one importer because I feel like they're a very, very ethical importer, and they have very strong standards for transparency and the data and how they source animals. And we sell to we sell to an online vendor that in the past had been extremely ethical on how they keep animals. So it's hard to point people to stores because stores don't always tell you where they buy their fish from.
Yeah.
Right. Because they want to keep it a secret, right? And you can't, for example, say, "Hey, go buy some less village fish," which I would love to tell people to do. Go buy Made's fish, right? Go buy their fish, right? They're great fish. Support less village. How are they going to do that? It's impossible.
That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to support an equitable trade. I mean,
I would love to see that. I can tell people to, they should buy fish from vendor A or B, but stores don't always advertise that, right? No, they don't. Yeah. Right. And so it's a real challenge with the fact that these things are alive and you can't sew a tag into them, right? And there's no certification body. The aquarium Trade tried that in the 90s, and it went up in flames because of some really horrible management on the, from the folks managing MAC. It just drove it into the ground. And so I don't know the solution. It would be nice to see some type of certification or labeling scheme come up, but that hasn't necessarily worked in seafood all that well. These are really challenging things. The only
are the genetic individual identifiers distinctive enough to be able to say, there's a unique genetic expression somewhere in the world, and I can take my fish at home and test it, and it has to come from this geographical region, or its ancestors came from this geographical region?
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to talk to Ben about that, because I think that's
Dr. Titus.
Yeah. I think that is very, very possible for certain fish, right?
Okay.
And so you could, most the organisms I've worked on at a population genetic level, we can pretty much tell where they're coming from. Some fish are so widespread, but you can get individual markers. It's not easy to do, but it's definitely possible. And so what I try to tell people is that, if you could buy Australian fish or Hawaiian fish or Fijian fish or fish from Kiribati, buy those.
Okay.
And tool exporters and importers that sell fish from the Philippines and sell fish from Indonesia and import fish from Indonesia can properly identify their supply chain. Don't buy it, right? And I love Indonesia, and I've been to the Philippines, and they're great people, and I love spending time in West Village in Indonesia, and that is a great place to buy fish from. I just don't know how to tell you how to get their fish. So if you want to make sure you're not contributing to destructive fishing practices, don't buy fish from areas that have those. And
it's good that you say that. It's really good you say that, because you haven't seen this yet, but yesterday on Saturday on MACNA 2021, during the Queensland exporter discussion panel, they were talking about better identifying their exports and making sure that the fact that it's Australian or the fact that it's from Queensland isn't lost in the supply chain, because everyone's just kind of rebranding their items once they get to the United States or once they get to the EU. So keeping that transparency up.
The corals are a great story. So I think Indonesia's mariculture story is one of the most interesting stories I got to watch kind of in real time in Indonesia. I flew to Indonesia in, I think, 2010 or 11 with some folks from the US government to help set up an international coral reef mariculture workshop. We get there and we're discussing coral mariculture, and there's a group we call them the three wise men in the back of the room. And these gentlemen basically had created Indonesian mariculture of corals at an industrial scale that not many people knew about in 2010 or 11. It was on its way. And after about a day and a half, they started talking to us about it. And they have a manual, they have a procedure, they have audits, they have tags. The corals are tagged with locations. The exporters cut the tags off before they ship them, or the importers cut the tags off because they don't want to know, they don't want to be identified as where they got their magic corals from. Yeah. And so all of that really interesting information that you would think would be highly marketable is lost. And, I would love to see tokens put under, like, on the bottom of
plugs.
Yeah, on the plugs. Yeah. People are going to snap the plugs off, but something, you could do anything. You could wire tag them. You could do all kinds of things with these corals to allow for some tracking. And I actually think people are sophisticated enough now that consumers are more sophisticated than they were in 2010 about this stuff. Think about your phone in 2010 versus where it is now, and technology. So the coral trade out of Indonesia should be something that we really support and promote. And I know hobbyists love their corals, they're growing and they frag swap and stuff like that. But I would really encourage people to buy aquaculture corals in Indonesia, because these are employing people who used to be cyanide and dynamite fishermen, right? They're employing those people, they're providing them income. And when you talk to these coral farmers, right, that used to dynamite fish for food, right, and sell that, and so they were blowing coral reefs up for food fishing, right? And now they get to spend time with corals and watch them grow. And when you talk to them, they are amazed at the growth of these corals, and they know their corals, and they're, it's amazing to talk to these ex-fishermen. They cannot believe what they used to do. And they set these coral farms up in these really kind of degraded habitats, and the fish come back. And then the fishermen see the fish come back, and they start making these connections between habitat and fit. And these are small stories, but you can't expect to change how people interact with their environment in mass in places where people are trying to survive and make a living. And you can't just legislate your way to it. You really have to work with people in that small scale way. And the impact that Lenny has had in Les Village, working with those fishermen, and they're doing some coral restoration there. And I saw someone from Mars Corporation give a presentation about coral restoration in a massive industrial scale, really impressive. And he kind of, he wasn't as positive, I think, about the smaller scale stuff people were doing as he should have been, because what this is doing is it's tying those fishermen back to their habitat. And they have marine protected areas they've set up. And so these are the things that we need to support, because it's going to help the environment and the fish that people love to keep, both at the same time. It's great that I grow fish in my lab, and we ship, we grow in royal gouramis right now, and yasagobis and fire shrimp and a few other things. That does aquaculture fish do benefit the trade. And it's really good that hobbyists can buy aquaculture fish. But sustainably caught wild fish arguably do much more to benefit those ecosystems than my production in my lab. Both are important, and I think they're both very important to the future of the aquarium trade. But the same is true with corals. People should see wild corals coming from Indonesia and support those, and be excited about those, and support that trade. And it's a murky environment out there. I cannot imagine being someone, some of like I said, these three wise people in the back of the room who invested their entire career's work into coral mariculture, and then poof, they can't export anything for a year or so, because some people in Indonesia are basically chop shopping their corals and acting like they're maricultured, and they're not really maricultured. And so you have a disparate situation where it got a little bit out of control in Indonesia, and they've got to get it back under control. And these people who've done it right have to suffer and wait through that. And so
I know you haven't watched Vincent's talk either, but Vincent is in Indonesia, and he's speaking to all of this as well. So make sure to check out that.
He's one of those people. Yeah, he's one of those people I'm talking about. Like I think they thought these Western, these Americans came over to show them, but they kind of had already done. No one had any idea that the workshops, the planning for these workshops started with Andy Bruckner and Eric Borman in 2001, 2002. It just took a long time to get governments interested in doing this. And so that work that Andy Bruckner and Eric Borman had done in the early 2000s, and the work that Vincent and the industry, the people who really saw things how they needed to be done, those coalesced together. And I think it's been really, really impactful in a positive way. It's just really unfortunate what has happened to people who have been trying to do the right thing, but we really need to support them.
Now, if you find Andy as inspirational as so many of us do, you can look him up. He's a professor at Roger Williams University. If you want to go back to college, you go to college for the first time, you can also be his student as an undergraduate. Andy, any final words here as the last speaker at MACNA 2021, where we're supporting an equitable trade? No pressure. No pressure.
No pressure. Kevin, I want to thank you for having the foresight to have this online. I really am tired of COVID and Zoom. But I think this is a great way to reach people in a time when it's been really isolating and difficult to be in groups in person. And I really hope people support an ethical trade. That is going to become more important in the future than they realize. You can't just hide in your basement, growing your own things, thinking that you're immune.
Thank you very much, Andy. And once again, you can go to macna.org/questions. You can ask Andy and any of the other speakers today a question, and the Q&A will follow this talk. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much.